important meeting about science as tool of democracy. And we are ready to start. And first of all, I have the pleasure to invite Professor Antonella Polimeni, Rector of Scienza, University of Rome.
Minister of University and Research and the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, President of Conference of Italian University Rectors, speakers, panelists, moderators, colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all and welcome to Sapienza University of Rome. It is a privilege for our university to host in the Aula Magna this workshop, and it is a great honor for me to bring you my personal greetings and those of the entire Sapienza community. The relationship between science and politics, and more generally between science and society, has been an issue of debate since antiquity. This has been particularly true in times of crisis, when politics feels the need to explicitly ask questions to science and scientists. In our country, the need for governments to base their choices on the address and support provided by scientists has been especially felt during economic and health crises. This attitude is not confined to Italy. Nevertheless, after the beginning of the 19th pandemic, that produced both a health and economic crisis, the principle, methods, and results of scientific research burst into public debate, and the governments of several countries have used technical scientific committees to counter the negative effects of pandemic on health, the economy, and the society. Science is, however, constantly present in the lives of citizens, changes the way they consume, produce, move. It is all affect climate, energy availability, justice, and birth rates. In this way, science inevitably influences politics, by which it is in its turn influenced, because a suitable political organization is a precondition for fostering scientific research and the knowledge that derives from it. The constant dialectic between science and politics is often described in terms of a tension between evidence and relevance, attributing to science the role to identify the former and to politics the role to establish the latter, setting priorities on the basis of values, opportunities, feasibility, consensus, and so on. Since the 1985, when Walter Botman and colleagues published the report titled The Public Understatement of Science, commissioned by the Royal Society, many have identified a possible way to solve this tension by increasing citizens' understanding of science and technology. We have progressively understood that the optimal functioning of an advanced democracy and its capability to recognize the relevance of data requires that citizens know about science. In this sense, a knowledge society becomes the most democratic, open, and fruitful possible outcome of the relationship between science and politics, as the public awareness of scientific and technological advance and their possible implication broadens the consensus for evidence-based policy decisions. For this reason, it is particularly important for university and research institutions to effectively realize their third mission. The knowledge society needs, in fact, a university that further develops in its own competence and expands its action in the field of cultural goods, health protection, technological transfer, non-profit continuing education, and public engagement, endowed with a high educational, cultural, and public utility value. In extreme synthesis, a knowledge society today needs a university that enlarge their scientific, social, and cultural contribution to favor the pursuit for a sustainable development goal in the UN 2030 agenda. This will expand citizens' understanding of scientific culture and innovation, foster knowledge exchange and communication between civil society and scientific research institutions, promote young people's interest in science, and encourage critical and creative thinking. There are not general goals, but necessary steps for the peaceful and democratic growth of contemporary society. This is why today's workshop is particularly important. Sapienza is ready to take up the challenges that will be raised by its contribution and to provide these resources to contribute the common goal of successfully realize a peaceful, democratic, and inclusive knowledge society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Polimeni. And thank you to the organizer of this meeting. Thank you to the Italian Minister of University and Research, to the Sapienza, University of Rome, and the Conference of the Italian University Rectors, and to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Now we have the next speakers of this session, the Ministry of Italian University and Research, Professor Maria Cristina Messa, the Benedetto Della Vedova, Undersecretary of Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and Professor Ferruccio Resta, President of the Conference of Italian University Rectors. Thank you very much for coming. And we know that we are in a very difficult time for society and for science too, because as we all know, science is a very important part of society. Science means creativity and innovation and wealth and democracy. And in these difficult times, it's very important to consider the value of science in society and to consider how the international relationship in this field are changing in a very dramatic way sometimes. And it is also time to consider how the information is changing in general, and in particular how the communication of science should change too. So we have a very busy afternoon today. We have a lot of interesting speakers, and I am pleased to introduce you the Italian Minister of University and Research, Professor Maria Cristina Messa. Please.
Thank you very much. And dear Undersecretary Della Vedova, dear President Resta, Rector Polimeni, and dear all participants. It's an honor for me to be here today to participate in such an important event whose aim is to showcase how the relationship between citizen and science is able to strengthen democracy process and to share the vision of many actors. Over the years, the Council of Europe has continuously emphasized the belief that education and science are vital to shaping a democratic culture. This includes forming attitudes and behavior which are necessary for the proper maintenance and innovation of the democratic process by exploring new ways of strengthening public and social engagements among citizens, starting with young people. Education and science help enable society to fully understand important contemporary challenges, resolve social conflicts, provide solutions to complex problems. More than 2 years of a global pandemic has challenged our day-to-day living and has brought uncertainty to our normal routines and the need for answers to new complex questions. Democracy is a precious asset that can never be taken for granted. It must be protected and nurtured daily by each of us. All of us today need to be educated to this end, also through the concrete and trustworthy guidance of science and research. A common cultural base defined by science and education helps citizens to develop and share a common identity, and it is crucial to the smooth running of the democratic process. This in turn allows the possibility to freely sharing knowledge, to introducing and encouraging new ideas and curiosity, in short, building a society's stable future. There are many challenges that are testing our ability to adapt and respond. The climate crisis, the loss of biodiversity, social conflicts, health risks, security, international emergencies, and conflicts for. These are forcing us to redefine what a sustainable development really is. The quality of life of future generations will depend on our ability to face these challenges clearly and fairly. If we were able to foster clear communication between science and citizens, to renew trust in scientific research, to consolidate the role of science as a tool to guide the choices of governments, and to invest in human capital, we will provide a new lifeblood to democracy. Making citizens aware of the great results that Italy has achieved and is in the process of achieving in the fields of research, along with the quality of educational system, can certainly help in reaching this important result. We need to make it possible for citizens to believe in the value of research as an essential tool to make the national, economic, industrial, and scientific systems more sustainable, competitive, and advanced. As you know, Horizon Europe has the key role in achieving this goal. The European funding program for research and innovation, which involves a budget of 95.5 billion euros, aims to strengthen the impact of research and innovation in developing and implementing European policies, while at the same time tackling global challenges and supporting human capital. Specifically, Horizon Europe has launched 5 research and innovation missions aimed at increasing the effectiveness of funding by pursuing crucial goals and solving some of the biggest challenges of our time, such as beating cancer, adapting the climate to climate change, restoring our seas and oceans, creating smart cities, and leading the transition towards healthy soils. We in Italy have the National Recovery and Resilience Plans. That is another best practice. In order to respond to the pandemic, Italy launched several calls for proposal to be funded under this program and to support the national research system. These investments will help Italy to become more sustainable and resilient. And finally, it has the aim of addressing the research and the results of the research for the benefit of the whole society. In order to really strengthen democracy, it is necessary to develop a new generation of scientists who are also skilled communicators to help increase public awareness regarding the crucial role that science and education play in shaping our future. It is essential to let people know that thanks to the expertise we have reached in such areas such as, for example, high-performance computing, quantum technologies, space, aerospace research, basic and applied research. It will be possible to develop new methods of personalized and predictive medicine, for example, to make weather forecasts more reliable, to predict catastrophic natural events, to develop increasingly technological materials, and operate with greater accuracy in the field of national security and artificial intelligence. So only a healthy democracy can honestly adapt to difficult social and economical circumstances, successfully face crucial challenges, and give future generations a society which meets their expectation. In essence, we believe that it is necessary to strongly support scientific research and education and to promote coherent scientific communication for a well-functioning democratic state. Thank you.
Mr. Messa, thank you very much for your optimism. Thank you very much. It is important to look at the future in a positive way in these times. Science is one of these ways. The other one is the cooperation at international level. And I introduce you Professor Benedetto Della Vedova, Undersecretary of Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Messa, President Resta, Rector Polimeni, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to intervene at this important workshop organized in cooperation with the Ministry of University and Research and in the framework of the Italian presidency of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. On 17th November 2021, we took up the presidency of the Committee of Ministers with the aim to encourage a common recommitment to the shared values and principles of the Council of Europe through dialogue and inclusivity. Among our strategic goals as presidency, we have promoted the pursuit of a people-centered future, fostering the role of the Council of Europe as a global standard setter in the domain of freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. In respect of such a role and in support of its ambitious mandate, the Council of Europe embraces a multi-stakeholder approach pursued through the engagement of all the relevant actors, from national parliaments to government institutions, from civil society to academia and the private sector. The theme of today's event, Citizens and Science as a Tool to Strengthen Democracy, stands out as a compelling call to maintain and even enhance this inclusive and comprehensive exercise, which is vital as we are standing before challenges and opportunities whose complexity requires a holistic approach. As current presidency of the Committee of Ministers, Italy has built a program with the aim of providing a space for open confrontation among member states and their societies based on how we can strengthen and update our joint commitment to the principles and values of the Council of Europe. In this endeavor, we consider science, as well as scientists and academics, to be our best ally. The right to science is a human right in itself, as enshrined in Article 15 of the legally binding International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and therefore it is one of the main building blocks of liberal democracies. Science based on empirical evidence makes them resilient against the risks of populism, political dogma and authoritarian drifts. It encourages a free and transparent exchanges of ideas and knowledge based on research. Surveys, before being published, undergo strict transnational peer reviews carried out by academics that have a consolidated expertise in their field. It is thanks to the tireless cooperation of professionals and practitioners that we have been able to develop effective vaccines and to distribute them all over Europe, as it was significantly apparent during the most dramatic weeks and months of the pandemic. Moreover, science helps to dispel the seeds of prejudice and discrimination, to promote synergies between institutions, academia, and the private sector, and has a great potential as an effective tool to support and advocate the protection and enforcement of universal human rights. As you may be aware, exactly 2 years ago, the United Nations adopted a general comment on science, reminding member states of their obligation vis-à-vis the right to science. The right to science includes freedom of research, the sharing of knowledge, and it encompasses not only a right to receive the benefits of its applications, but also a right to participate in scientific progress. People benefit from science, but science can also benefit from people. As we are witnessing the tragedy of an unprovoked, unjustified, and unjustifiable conflict in Ukraine, waged by the Russian Federation against civilians in patent violation of the most basic norms of international humanitarian law, we should do our utmost to renew our efforts to preserve our open societies. And in the effort to counter disinformation, to reaffirm our principles and values enshrined in the statute and conventions of the Council of Europe, we need the support of all the stakeholders in the scientific and academic environment. At the same time, we should also be concerned of how the conflict can affect scientific progress and academic freedom in research centers and university departments of the aggressor country. I would like to take this opportunity to praise universities for their commitment, their public engagement, and their efforts to generate knowledge beyond academic circles by reaching out to the general public to the benefit of social, cultural, and economic development. Your contribution feeds into our common purpose of supporting well-functioning democracies, a purpose we should all strive to advocate and reaffirm today more than ever. Let's remain aware that only a multidisciplinary, inclusive, and multi-stakeholder approach can guarantee concrete, sustainable, and long-lasting results. We believe it is essential to maintain a constant dialogue between the Council of Europe and the scientific and academic community in order to promote democratic values and the free circulation of ideas based on facts. Such dialogue has to be promoted and pursued in both directions in order to sustain dynamics of cross-pollination that can better serve our purpose. In this respect, I am glad to highlight the recent financial contribution by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation to the Open Council of Europe Academic Networks, OCEAN, a project designed to mainstream in the Council of Europe knowledge and information, including its principles and values, into higher education, training, and research. Thanking all participants for their valuable contribution, I wish all a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it is true, in this time is mandatory to preserve the open society and a dialogue and to promote the democratic values. Probably, certainly, universities have an important role in this collaboration, in this opening society. And I ask to speak about this to Ferruccio Resta, that is the President of the Conference of the Italian University Rectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear Minister Messa, dear Undersecretary della Vedova, dear Rector Polimeni, authorities, speakers, guests, thank you for having me here. I'm happy to join you in this important discussion. Sustainability, inclusion, climate change, energy transition, big data, artificial intelligence, health, cybersecurity, just to mention some of the biggest issues the world is going through. Issues that in a way or another we are dealing with at different levels. Issues where science and technology play an important role. Disruptive technologies have an enormous potential and a vast impact, but they're not just a matter of science and research. They're not limited to universities and labs. On the contrary, they are shaping economic processes and social policies. They are becoming part of everyday life, changing people's habits, relations, and ways of thinking. On top of that, history is taking its course. From COVID-19 to the war in Ukraine, unexpected events are making things even more complex. Indeed, complexity is the key point. Complexity is the challenge of our time. And now the question is, how do we deal with it? From my point of view, two things are necessary. First of all, we need a solid scientific base. There is no question that science and technology are the drivers of change. And because of that, being responsive is not enough. We need to look ahead, to foresee what is coming next. The only way to do that is improving research, investing in knowledge, infrastructure, in human capital, turning the next generation Europe, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, into an incredible opportunity to design the future. The second ingredient is the dialogue, not only inside the scientific community, but also with society at large, policymakers, managers, citizens. It's important to set up a cultural process of change where science and technology advance side by side with the humanities in a multidisciplinary and complex way to develop a democratic culture to improve the quality of the democracy. All this considered, scientific communication is fundamental to delivering our values correctly, in increasing public debate, in raising our credibility. Therefore, scientific communication has to be quick in order to adapt to changing scenarios, innovative in order to master new tools and new languages, and open in order to get out of its traditional borders and reach out to other communities. But most of all, it has to be reliable to inspire and encourage solid, long-lasting and democratic process of change. All aspects that will be discussed during the following talks, which today I have the honor to introduce. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Resta. Thank you to all the speakers of this first part of the opening session. And we are ready to pass at the second part of this session with two other speakers. The first one is Professor Telmo Pievani, that is Professor of Philosophy of Science at University of Padua. And the other speaker is Francesco Sette, that is the General Director of European Synchrotron and Chair of Euroforum. So, after the institutional speeches about the relationship between science and society, we now are ready to look at this topic with another point of view, the point of view of philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is very important in society because contributes to spreading the awareness of the role of science in society, and it helps society to understand how science works, how is the thinking of science, the scientific method, for example, and the language of science. So let me introduce Telmo Pievani, professor of philosophy of science at the University of Padua.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Enrica. Thanks for inviting me to this panel, and it's a privilege to be here. And thanks to the rector, thanks to the Minister of University and Research, and all the authorities. I'm going to propose to you a very brief reflection about science communication and philosophy of science. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemics, and I'd say, and before it and after it, climate change, emergency, and the environmental crisis have been very hard crash tests and shocks for science communication. It never happened before that scientists and researchers for years were the main actors in all the mass media and social media, even in a situation of strong social anxiety and fear and political pressure. Never happened before. Public opinion had to quickly become familiar in times of fear and uncertainty with the faces of researchers who every day dispensed comments and forecasts to society, offering data and evidence, talking and arguing with each other. Science communication has to be, for me, approached with a scientific and statistical attitude, not with anecdotal sources, stories, or impressions. The surveys led by companies specialized in monitoring the public perception of science, later in the roundtable, you will be listening to Massimiliano Bucchi with Observer Science Society, is a pioneer in this field. They attest that the trust in the scientific community in Italy is very high, but the trust in the capabilities of science to communicate and share contents dropped significantly between the first lockdown and the end of the second, a year later, unfortunately. So this is a failure in science communication. The main cause of the loss of confidence and trust seems to be the contradictory and misleading features of the messages coming from the scientific community during the pandemic. It's therefore not just a question of people in Italy become addicted or the usual reference to the poor scientific cultures of Italians or Europeans that are excuses for me and escapes that no longer hold. If we want to respect the scientific method, we should be self-critical. We had problems in science communication, and we have to confront with them. The unexpected conditions of the situation, the surprise, of course, the unpreparedness do not fully justify the many errors of science communications that were committed during the pandemic and even before with climate change. Science has been asked for certainties and for be sure, but science navigates in uncertainty, and its results, obtained slowly and with hard work, are probabilistic and continuously updated and revised. But the probability, as cognitive sciences show very well, is difficult to think and explain. It's counterintuitive. Science has been asked for precise predictions and forecasts, which, however, science, for the same reason, can rarely offer to the people. Scientists who have the responsibility of communication on the mass media should never act as custodians of the objective truth, a truth to be given paternalistically to the lay people. But they have to explain their reasons. They have to argue, clarify the mechanisms of the phenomena, compare hypotheses without hiding the scope of the uncertainty. Some scientists have spoken in the media about subjects outside their competence, if they were omniscient. And often we have not been able to say an important thing to citizens. We don't know yet a lot of things. We are investigating. We don't know. Not to mention the fact that scientific debates must be held in the appropriate locations and institutions. So congresses, journals, of course, not on TV talk shows or on social media and social network. Among others, for me, two main failures stand out. First, we didn't do enough to distinguish between the opinions and interpretations of individuals, on the one hand, and the institutional voices on the other. Being the second, holders of the communication of what we call in philosophy of science the scientific consensus, that is very important on data and explanations. To have institutional scientific spokespersons who dialogue with political decision makers, with journalists, with magistrates during the trials and so on, it doesn't imply a censorship of the free expression of individual scientists. Rather, it's an essential public service that we have in many other countries. In Italy, we listened for a long time only to scientists who spoke in their personal capacity, but that doesn't work. Secondly, and mostly for me, science has to be understood not only as a product, so data, numbers, fact, evidence, theories, and so on, but also, and above all, has a process, has an attitude, has a method of investigation based on the continuous revision of your own assumptions, on the updating of evidence, on uncertainty, and probabilistic analysis, on rational evaluation. The National Recovery and Resilience Plan is an extraordinary occasion not only for Italian research, of course, but also for implementing a democratic sharing of scientific knowledge in a concrete way with the general audience, and even with people that never heard about quantum computing or RNA-based therapies, or about the amazing biodiversity of our country. In Italy, we walk over a treasury of intelligence, beauty, and biodiversity. For me, it's essential for building a scientific citizenship, that is the topic of this afternoon, to learn to communicate science as a process. Because in this way, we are also able to explain much more effectively even the scientific results. It's crucial to tell the public how we arrive at the scientific result, with thorough investigation, continuous collective examination of the results, always admitting ignorance. Yes, ignorance is not a bad word in science. Science is a continuous challenge to the unknown. to what we know that we don't know, and even to what we didn't know that we don't know. The most unexpected and fascinating part of science, that is serendipity. The scientific method is based on generative errors and good ignorance. That is, the awareness of not knowing enough, which fits our curiosity and opens to the possibility of discovering something that you were not searching for. That is great. As Harvard historian of science Naomi Oreskes wrote, we must trust science because science fails. It seems paradoxical, but it's very true. The magic of science is that by criticism, knowledge increases rather than being weakened. And with the growth of knowledge, the question marks increase in science rather than decrease. That's the magic of science. We know more, and we know that we don't know much more. Communicating science as a process, an attitude, and a set of methodologies also makes us more effective in fighting the worrying and insidious phenomenon of the proliferation of anti-scientific and pseudoscientific fake news, especially on social media. Anti-scientific when they deny scientific evidence, pseudoscientific even more dangerous when they mimic scientific theories and hypotheses. We become more effective against them when we don't just debunk fake news, but we dismantle them by showing their tricks, mystifications, and persuasion techniques, thus offering to the public not only a debunking, but also the critical antidote to identify and unmask the fake news. Fake news proliferates on the web because the internet is their perfect ecological niche, and because they feed on economic interest, psychological consolations, social resentment, and distrust of institutions. They are built exactly to become digital viruses that infect our minds. We are studying this phenomenon. They will survive all our attempts, I guess, but when they threaten people's health, I think that they should be punished and prosecuted. Communicating science as a process also allows us to fully grasp, and I'm going to conclude with this final point, the contribution of science to the strengthening of democracy, another topic of this afternoon. If, in fact, the established scientific results are not democratic, of course, in the sense that they are not subject to public opinion or to the decision of the majority, but to experiments, evidence, and so on, it's equally true that science as a process is an extraordinary example of democratic practices and rules. I mean, comparison between peers, freedom of expression, of research, of movement, the value of dissent and doubt, the rejection of any pre-established authority, the transparency in data sharing, and so on and so on. All very democratic practices and rules in the process of science, not in the results of science. Yes, we know that sadly, we can do science and mostly good technology, even in non-democratic countries, unfortunately. But I think, and I continue to think, that critical and free spirit of science is by its nature incompatible with any authoritarianism, because it's a universal language of collaboration and peace, as Giorgio Parisi said in this wonderful Aula Magna. And above all, it's a fragile heritage, just like democracy, because it's always threatened, both science and democracy, by easier, more intuitive, dangerous, intriguing mental and social shortcuts. So we must love and defend democracy and science together precisely because they are non-irreversible achievements of humanity. They require maintenance, care. They are fragile and vulnerable, but also very resistant in all three spirits' minds, exactly as we are seeing in these dramatic weeks of war in Europe. So, concluding, for me, science and democracy have many powerful enemies, and we have to know them. They have enemies because they are based on freedom. They are based on the idea of an open society. But we have tools and skills to defend them together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Piovani. You said about errors in science communication, and as science journalist, I say yes, it's true. There are a lot of errors, but in my opinion, the main error is to say the impossibility to say we don't know. We have seen during the pandemic how it is difficult to say I don't know, because there is the volunteer to say to give some certainty, but we have not this certainty, and this is a problem of analphabetism too. Unfortunately, in our country, not only analphabetism in science, but all the fake news that unfortunately we hear and we read every day have origin in this analphabetism, in this problem. But we face another point of view of the relationship between science and society, and we listen Francesco Sette, Professor Sette, about the communication between scientific institutions in Europe. Professor Sette is Director General of European Synchrotron, and this institution, this center of research, has a leading role in the field of synchrotron lights in Europe and in the world, thanks to their innovative hardware, which has become a worldwide benchmark. And please.
Thank you. Thank you. Dear Minister Messa, dear Dr. Della Vedova, dear President of the CRUI, Professor Resta, and dear Rector Piovani, it's an honor and it's also a pleasure to come back to the alma mater, so where I'm coming from, this wonderful La Sapienza University. So thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to spend a few words on such an important theme. We have heard the institutional speech that already set the tone very high. We heard Professor Piovani. I will take the issue from a slightly different perspective. I'm also prepare a little presentation, and on something that I think is extremely important and has been mentioned, that today, in the complexity in which we live, enabling science is extremely important. And there is, on one side, the obvious role of all the academic institutions, but to enable science, you also need to have an adapted infrastructure and highly knowledgeable people that dedicate their knowledge to enable the next steps to the best minds. And I want to also underline one word that I didn't hear so far too much, and it's the young generation. In other words, what is important is to establish those links that goes across generations. Sometimes we have the feeling that our society goes too fast, and we are losing the young people. This is the future. So we always have to remember that what we do is, in particular, in constructing a system to educate and to do science, the young people should be at the center of our choices. So I'm talking to you today also on behalf of Euroforum. Euroforum is the European research organizations that make Europe particularly fundamental. So we all agree that science is a universal value and a unifying value, which is at the heart of our democracy. And is by nature because it brings people together and transcends all cultural and other differences. We also have to remind that today, science is mostly publicly funded. So we have, as scientists, as an enablers of science, a key responsibility towards the citizens that are funding our research. So it's very, very important that these values are shared in order to enable science to contribute to a peaceful and sustainable growth of citizens' life. So there's a real paradigm change in human society, I would say after World War II, not clashes between countries, religions, populism and nationalism, but sharing progress and Republican values. This is what is at the heart of our society and should also be at the heart of science. And unfortunately, we are seeing that this is not the case. And I cannot resist to remember this manifesto to the Europeans that was written in 1914, and 100 years later, Professor Nicolai was the president of CNR, and Christina was vice president, Minister Messa was the vice president, and we also had Luigi Berlinguer. Wanted to remind this manifest that at the end it was signed only by 4 people, and one of them was Albert Einstein. And when we had this meeting in 2014, we almost said, well, that's old stuff. That is something, that is not there anymore. Today, if we read what's written in there and how important the scientist and the role of a democratic society is to take care of conflict and to understand also that when there is a conflict, we need to mediate. We need to find a solution that takes into account the needs of all the participants to that conflict. So coming back to Euroforum, Euroforum is 8 intergovernmental organizations. They are listed there. They started in 1954 with CERN, and then during the years they develop. And I think this is something that Europe should really be proud of, because there's no other place in the world where we have so performing research infrastructure, and at the same time, this research infrastructure are really open to the world. And you have this development that started because one country alone couldn't make it, but once these countries got together, they did much more than was initially thought. And they have very strong common trends, like excellence in science, commitment to society, and a sound governance. And how this is declined? It's declined to engage in science policy initiatives on all matters that are related to international scientific cooperation, the construction and strengthening of the European research area, and the citizens awareness on the role of science in our model of society and its future, all that we have heard so far. So, and here I want to come back to share the European values that we have been able to develop over the last 50 years. Civilization power at the place of nuclear power. So, we need to address the strong connections between tomorrow's needs of society, and we heard that extremely well from the intervention of the president of directors of Italy, and the needs of science at the frontier. So it's really science for society, what is the basis of a success for a global response to challenges, and we have seen it with the COVID-19 pandemic, in which, again, the role of science, and in particular the role of Europe, because I want to remind that the vaccine was discovered in Europe with the support of the European Commission. So, this also has been mentioned, but I want to repeat it. Science is not just discovery, it's innovation technology, so it's creating jobs. Science today is confronted with huge issues in terms of data policy and handling, so information technology, European Open Science Cloud, constructing digital Europe, again, it's at the heart of today's scientific challenge. And I want to come to science, education, and communication, sharing progress and scientific breakthroughs in order to promote the role of science for peaceful growth of our new generations. And this, again, brings to the previous speaker. Addressing environment and climate change's challenges is also another key aspect that science has to address today in order to contribute to a sustainable well-being of the planet. I want to give you an example of the lab that I have the honor to direct since a few years now. We are bringing together 21 partner countries. Our specialty is X-ray synchrotron science to link atomic structure of condensed matter to functions and complexity of all the world that is around us, and inspire and sharing knowledge and scientific progress with the general publics and especially with the young generation. Just to give you here an example, what we have been doing over the last 10 years. You see 74,000 individuals that used this infrastructure from all over the world, although this is mostly funded by European countries. And it's today a vibrant hub, welcome people from many research fields, all genders and all culture to advance science and serve society. A science program which is extremely well aligned with all the major challenges in terms of health, materials for tomorrow, clean energy transition, planetary research, environmental and climatic challenges, bio-based economy and food security, humanity and world cultural heritage, and is also extremely well aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals of UNESCO. And very recently, I cannot resist to show you one of the biggest results that is coming since the last couple of years. Everything started with the COVID-19 crisis and the realization that X-rays at the ESRF could be used to image down to the subcellular level a full organ of somebody, in this case, that died of COVID-19. And very rapidly, this became something that was seen as a true revolution for investigation in medicine, has got a major funding from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, and is really giving us a new view on our understanding on how disease develops, for example, in a human body. And is a revolution that comes, for me, 500 years after the first attempts to really have an analytical approach to anatomy, basically back to Leonardo da Vinci. We stay at the 45th parallel. That was in Milano 500 years ago. Now we are in Grenoble. So, to conclude, so Aeroforum is there promoting outreach activity to nurture the young generation in a respectful and tolerant environment that values diversity and inclusiveness. Taking an active part in collaboration with other European scientific organizations in a forward look at promising and or developing research to tackle the complex societal challenges facing our societies. Providing a coordinated representation to the world, including the general public, national governments, and non-European countries. All this we have done, and all this we want to continue to do to serve science for the benefit of Europe and the benefit of the world. So with that, I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sette. And we are ready to pass to the other part of this session with the round table. And thank you very much. The round table is about the active engagement of higher education and science, with some practical examples. We will listen to other actors in the field of the active engagement of higher education and science. Our speakers of this afternoon are Patrick Levy, that is member of the board of the European University Association, and Peggy Pavlevich, member of the Executive Committee of European Students' Union, Massimiliano Bucchi, member of Scientific Committee of Observa Science in Society, Matthias Gurden, member of DG Democracy, the Directorate for Democratic Participation of European Council, and Riccardo Haupt, Head of Strategy of WIL Italy. Well, the communication of science is changing, and the social media are playing an increasingly important role in both scientific journalism and in general in the communication of science. More and more often, the social media are becoming sources for journalists, for example. Let's just think about the way in which many institutions communicate using Twitter, for example. So we have a very sorry. We have a lot of topic to discuss in this round table, and we will start with Patrick Levy about the ongoing military crisis in the world and the consequences for work and for the role of association you represent.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Well, of course, the situation created by the Russian invasion in Ukraine is particularly difficult. And that means that, of course, the democratic mission of our universities is more than ever in front of our eyes. So we expressed, the EUA, as many others, expressed a statement on Ukraine. And of course, the EUA is standing in solidarity with the university student, the staff of Ukraine, and of course condemn in this aggression in the strongest possible terms. Of course, this means that we have joined our forces with the European Students' Union, with the Erasmus Student Network, with the European Union of Jewish Students, with the Scholars at Risk, with the Syrian Refugee Student Network and the Norwegian Students and Academic International Student Fund, in expressing our solidarity with the Ukrainian people and the educators and learners in the country, as well as in the neighboring territories that are suffering due to Russia's war of aggression and a progressively developing full-scale invasion. Of course, this is changing, of course, dramatically our role, for sure. And of course, EUA call universities in Europe to act upon their democratic role, to encourage them to denounce and press for an end of the war, and to provide assistance through whatever means possible to support university communities and those affected by the conflict. So I think, and probably we will all agree on that, that the fact the war in Ukraine indeed showed the role that university can play in being promoters of peaceful cooperation, mutual understanding, and tolerance across borders, and the importance of countering actions that go against these values. And this is a reason why we actually add, which is of course a completely unique decision, to suspend most Russians members of EUA due to their support of the March statement by the Russian Union of Rectors, which effectively supported the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is, of course, in clear breach of EUA values. And of course, we maintain our support to individual academics that have actually condemned this invasion, but we had to suspend our institutional relationship. So that is basically what has changed. Of course, the most important thing is to support individuals, scholars at risk, and all the people in Ukraine that are facing so many difficulties.
Thank you. And now, Peggy Pavletic. Peggy Pavletic is a member of European Students' Union that represent 45 national union of students in 40 countries. So his voice is very interesting, very important, and it's important to know your opinion about the current situation.
Much, Enrica, and buonasera a tutti. It's very nice to be here. It's my first time in Rome as well. As Patrick said, some of the efforts that we have done as the organization to address the question of Ukraine has been joint, I would say, since our organization collaborate quite well. I have also had some personal experiences being a member of the selection committee for the National Ukrainian Quality Assurance Agency, and we can see how much they tried to make a very transparent process and to really develop and I would say move forward with the quality of their education and the development in general of their goals, which was abruptly stopped by the war. And quite recently, actually, we have had the experience of listening to the students directly by a video transmission, speaking with our student representatives from the war sites, which is something that really shakes you as a person and makes you look at this perspective quite differently. So, of course, we joined and have written the statements and supported everyone who opposed the Russian aggression, and we are still to this day collecting the efforts and the initiatives that national bodies are organizing just to support the students. And one of such initiatives also comes from Italy, and it's from my university, so I'm very proud of it, from Camerino. So I know that there are some scholarships, for example, for Ukrainian students who wish to come and study and resume their studies. And I think that's very valiant, but there isn't nearly enough support as much as they need, and this is something that even though you are trying to move forward and you're trying to show how much you care, you simply are not in this situation, and all the effort counts for them. And we can see how relevant this is, not only on the European level, where we make the discussions and decide on whether to support something or not, but also really in the field.
Thank you, Peggy. And now, Massimiliano Bucchi, that is member of Observa Society, that is a non-profit and independent center of research about the relationship and the interaction between science and society. So what is your point of view about the current difficulties in the relationship between science and society?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I think probably the key challenge for science in society and science communication today is a major change. That the key actors of science communication are not anymore the news media, traditionally speaking, are not social media, contrary to what sometimes we hear, but are researchers and their institutions. And this didn't start with the pandemic. This is a long-term process that starts with the expansion of the third mission, with the changes in the technological landscape, making available tools like online tools, for example, to research institutions. This is what we call in my field mediatization of research. But of course, the pandemic, clearly, we could describe it as the greatest experiment in science communication in the history of humanity, because we had never seen in prime time so many scientific experts, no? For example. And then, of course, we saw all the potential of this situation, that research institutions, academic institutions, researchers can speak directly to the public, but also all the risks of this, because many of them were not prepared to deal with such responsibility, and they didn't realize what could be the consequences of something. If you say, for example, something about vaccine and vaccine experiments, vaccine experimentation and approval in a scientific conference, the same thing is one thing. If you say it on primetime television during an epidemic crisis, during a pandemic crisis, it's a completely different thing. So this, for me, translates into a challenge of quality. I don't like the term fake news. I think it is too simplistic and is misleading. It's not the problem of fake news, of course. There is a problem of the quality of information, which is a structural problem today, and it's not easy to solve because we live in a paradox that we complain about the quality of information, but people don't want to pay for information. They expect it to be free. And of course, this in science communication, particularly when it comes to health, is a very serious issue. So I think, and I think it's very important that we have this discussion together with the Association of Italian Rectors and Universities. There is a great challenge, as I said, for academic institutions in terms of communication, and also in terms of understanding that communication has to be based on data, as Telmo Pievani was saying, and it has to rely on professional expertise. Science communication cannot be improvised by anyone just because they know something about a scientific subject. We need people trained in science communication to work in research institutions, to work with the scientists. And also, one element of this quality, and I conclude, we should never forget, is that communication is not just about talking about research, for example, but it's also about listening. It's a two-way process. So we cannot continue to rely on stereotypes that people are ignorant, that people don't like science, because this is not true. This is a paternalistic attitude. It's an ideology that exempts research institutions from doing good science communication. Because if the people are stupid, you don't care. You do whatever you want in science communication.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Matthias Gruden, in times when democracy values are under threat, how can we ensure that our higher education institutions are educating concerned citizens?
Well, that's a very good question. You will perhaps understand that coming from the Council of Europe, an organization that was set up to promote and protect democracy, liberal democracy, I would nevertheless like to add a few words about the general relationships between democracy and science and knowledge. And I think in short, if you want to understand the importance of science and knowledge, research, creativity, innovation, for democracy, you just have to look at how authoritarians and dictators fear those things, mistrust, try to instrumentalize, control. If they don't, then obstruct and perhaps even suppress. We have a recent example of that in that tragic and horrible context of the Russian aggression on Ukraine. It was mentioned already by Patrick earlier, when we've had one of the first public, strong reactions in the Russian Federation against the aggression coming from hundreds of scientists protesting against the war. And that we have seen how the Putin's government regime has responded to that by orchestrating the signature of rectors. Now, I'm not implying that rectors have been all coerced or that they have not done it out of conviction. We don't know that. But it was clearly that it was a response of the regime because they had to show that they are controlling the university, academic, scientific community because they fear them, and rightly so, in every society. Not because these people will be politically oriented, but because in an authoritarian regime, people dealing with science, people dealing with facts, people dealing with knowledge and devoted to these things are a threat. We have also, I think, generally speaking, over the last years, when we have seen this preoccupying process of democratic backsliding in many parts of Europe, when we see these creeping authoritarian approaches in different areas, we are very often concerned, and rightly so, with the restrictions on media freedom, on civil society, on clamping down on political dissent, but somehow we are not paying the same attention to something that is equally intense and equally dangerous and equally aggressive, and that is attempts to restrict, suppress academic freedom, autonomy of universities, that we are seeing again and again as a part of that same populist authoritarian pattern. And Council of Europe is, I think, the only intergovernmental international organization so far that, because of the aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine, has expelled Russian Federation from its membership. And that already has some collateral implications. We have been for years in the organization trying to conduct the work on the issues of academic freedom, autonomy of universities, and we have been in this work quite skillfully obstructed by a member state that is now no longer a member state. And I think the sad truth is that sometimes the authoritarians are better prepared than Democrats, who are very often asleep at the wheel. And I think that's one lesson we have to draw from what we are living so far. And I'll just conclude on this general question of why science is important for democracy and democracy is important for science. I think it's been built in at the very beginning, at the very foundation of that European, if you wanted, civilization and model that we have developed after the Second World War, which was on one hand an antithesis of that horrible experience that we've had with realizing what Europeans are able to do to fellow Europeans before and during the Second World War, which is now coming back in some force. And secondly, building on the legacy of the Enlightenment, of the, that revolution of knowledge, science, individual rights, freedoms. So that was at the heart of it. And it's, I always like to emphasize that, for example, when the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights were set up in 1950, the first international council convention that was set up after that was the European Cultural Convention. And what does the European Cultural Convention do? Promote cooperation in education, in language learning, history, culture, and heritage. The people who were setting up that civilization and model after the Second World War, among the ruins, the war was 5 years ago, of people who understood and lived through the hell that the Second World War, knew that if you create an institution, such as a European Court of Human Rights, that will not be enough, that you will have to create that environment to make it work, and that the way to create this environment goes through education, goes through culture, goes through the science, and that belief into the legacy of the Enlightenment. We have forgotten that lesson, I think, for far too many years. We have taken things for granted. We have not invested too much in this, and now we are unfortunately paying dividends. So I think that in reversing this situation, I'm sorry I'm long, I'll stop. In reversing this situation, the role of education in general as a part of the return to trust into rationality, science, facts, is essential. I don't think we will be able to do it without universities. I think universities are key players as the custodians and generators of knowledge and science in our societies. I think it will be very important to restore confidence, because the confidence has been breached between parts of society and the world of science and knowledge. Communication will be and must be an important part of that. But just following on just responding to what Massimo said before, I also think people are not stupid. But also that doesn't mean that there is not a significant part or important part of the population that for different reasons is seeing a revolt, a rejection of science as a sort of a way of gaining self-confidence and self-dignity. It sees as a part of the revolt against prejudice, often very, very, very justified. So it's not, we are not going to overcome that problem simply by explaining them the facts, counting that they're intelligent enough to understand them and acknowledge their mistakes, because it's not going to work in this way. We need to also address the reasons, the roots of why so many people in our societies feel in this way about scientists as a part of the elites that they reject. Sorry, I was long. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have the time, enough time for other questions to our panelists. And one of the questions is how will be the future after this crisis? How will be the future in the world, and in particular for science and relationship between countries, research between researchers and scientific institutions of different countries. And what could be the tools that we can use to, what kind of tool we can imagine as the most useful in the future after this crisis to reconstruct scientific collaboration. And Patrick Levy. Oh, we have, oh, sorry. So sorry. Ricardo Haupt.
Here I am in streaming. I'm sorry, I hope you hear me properly. properly. And I'm really and so sorry not to be there, but unfortunately this not so friendly pandemic got me. We were almost at the end, and unfortunately I had an issue this morning with the pandemic. So thank you very much for the invitation, and again, sorry for not being there physically. So, well, I think the first question I tried to answer as we organize this roundtable is the role of the conflict on our work. Well, our work, the work we do at Will. Will is one of the biggest, probably today, the biggest digital native media company in Italy, which is aimed to bring complexity and complex arguments towards new generations in a place, social media, where typically complexity is not really feeling at home, because you have to imagine every day we fight between someone cooking bread and some fashion influencer beyond us. So we need to try to bring complexity in there. This complexity has had many names. At some point was the pandemic, and now, well, we have had the conflict, probably the biggest tragedy we've dealt with. Actually, from a social media perspective, probably one of the biggest thing ever happened, at least in the European continent. We just finished a meeting here, a data room here at Will. We just studied the numbers of how we performed in the last month in terms of new followers and engagement rate with our followers, and the same we did with some of the biggest media players around Europe. Well, the growth in terms of engagement and new followers and the attention people had towards these topics is totally unprecedented. These numbers that we've seen with Ukraine are totally unprecedented. So we've seen an impressive attention from new generations towards this conflict. It has been the first conflict shown on social media, the first EU conflict, European conflict shown on social media, and the first conflict that Gen Z has actually witnessed after they became, let's say, grown up. So this has been, on one hand, an extremely interesting phenomenon to study somehow. On the other hand, it has also shown the way the information society we live in works and how quick it goes. So we've seen this incredible peak that actually only lasted, this was dramatic, we just seen the data, 8 to 10 days, the first 8 to 10 days of the conflict. Then the attention span actually blows up, and performances of digital medias all around Europe are just going down in terms of video views and interactions with their posts, because also the war in modern society has the capability of becoming, let's say, I'll say a tremendous word, but please allow me, boring. And so it is a huge task to try to bring attention of new generations for a longer time spent on these sort of arguments. But so on the other hand, I need to, how are social media doing in this conflict, and how are we working on it? Well, on the one hand, we've seen the incredible potential of social networks. People living in a digitalized country like Ukraine had the possibility to communicate with the rest of the world through social networks, and to raise money also in order to live through social networks like Airbnb and Google. On the other hand, for sure, there is this huge problem of fake news. The fake news task nowadays is not just a problem with people being in a bad faith, so imagine people who are willing to spread fake news on social medias, but there is also a boomerang effect coming from those people who actually are communicating on social medias in a good faith, but are incurring in the production of fake news. So the production of one single fake news, a single fake video that even people in good faith are posting on a social network, it can be Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, is capable of having an impressive boomerang effect. So if you in good faith post a fake news, a fake video on a social network, this will for sure be used, for example, by Russian supporters in this phase to say that, okay, there's no definition of truth. So this is the biggest task of people trying to communicate on social networks. We've already seen it during the scientific communication issues that we experienced throughout the pandemic, and now we are trying to face this task also during the conflict, which is probably the biggest task new medias, and not only new medias, but also traditional medias have to face nowadays. And if I can give you a small example of this way, and the importance of fact-checking in what is happening in these days, I give you the small example of what happened with this dramatic and extremely viral video of the Ukrainian troops entering Bucha in the last couple of days. Everyone has seen this video, but the first who actually built a campaign on it were the Russians, who started saying that this video was fake because bodies were moving or some other crazy idea, just because the video was in a low quality. BBC, actually, traditional media, but a super high quality media, did a terrific work in debunking this theory throughout technology, trying to demonstrate how the video was deformed throughout lenses and from the vehicles that were moving around the streets in Bucha. So again, the traditional and new media just need to do their work properly, fact check everything we see. Also, when we see content coming from people that we may say and may define in a good faith, not just those in bad faith. So thank you, and I leave the floor to the other speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Riccardo, and sorry again. Now here, the next question is about the future and the tools to prepare to afford the future. Patrick Levy, do you believe that the current initiative of European Commission regarding research assessment reform could be able on the long term to strengthen the links between citizen and science?
Well, we'll see that, but yes, I think the current reform of research assessment is actually in line with what the panelist has already mentioned, the fact that among the role of universities, there is this engagement in society, and the fact that strengthening the civil engagement is also important. And there is also what Francesco Sette just mentioned about the fact that we have to demonstrate that science has a social impact. This is absolutely important. So that means we cannot only assess research by impact factors or even publication in the best journal. That is, of course, important. We don't, at least regarding publishing in the best journals, but this is not enough. This is not enough to demonstrate to the citizens that science is useful and science should be supported. So in a way, the current reform research assessment that is starting, that has been initiated by the European Commission, we believe that's quite positive in a sense that, first of all, it's online with our own vision of universities. We have actually a strategic plan which is called EUA Vision for 2030, which is University Without Walls, which I think is self-explaining what we want to do. We want universities much more connected with citizens, much more connected with their priorities, which doesn't mean that we lower the level of exigence in terms of research, in terms of quality of research, but we want to connect that and to have demonstrators, in a sense, that evidence the impact of science. So yes, I believe that the initiative of the European Commission which is to develop and implement more responsible, transparent, and sustainable evaluation practice for research activities and careers, including, of course, open science, is extremely important. It is, I think, a huge challenge, and the European Commission is essentially now promoting something that will be supported by a research organization, that will be supported by evaluation agencies, that will be supported by universities. But that's an important step for, I would say, strengthening the links between society and universities and providing more support to the role of university, again, in civil engagement on one hand, but also to support democracy. So we'll see where we go, but that's important for us.
Thank you. And Peggy, in your point of view, what could be useful tools to use in future to reinforce the relationship between science and society?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that, I have to agree with what Patrick said, and I think that, well, maybe it's a kind of an unpopular opinion, but I think the science should be there for the purpose of science, and we have the educational sector that is there to do the kind of the mediation between the science and the society in general. And I think that maybe in some aspects the higher education, how it is structured now, is kind of failing a little bit on making this distinction and making this connection between the society and in general the science. Science is, I would say, underfunded. The finances come from the public sector, and they're limiting the scope of what all we can do. But there are like citizen programs that can be developed. There is lifelong learning platforms. We have the open educational resources. We are now in the process of creating micro-credentials. These are all the tools that we can use better than what we are doing now. And there's still quite an opposition at the higher education level towards introducing these measures, because how will we prove the quality? But just because we don't have currently developed systems doesn't mean that we have to stop trying or letting it develop as it is. The American higher education system has done a very good job there, where citizen science is being valued. So if you are getting a job interview and, for example, you participate in scientific communications, you participate in projects which are organized for citizen science, you enter your data in citizen science applications, etc., you earn certain badges, and this is what distinguishes you from just a regular citizen that sits at home. And there is still this bridge that we see, that once the student leaves higher education, they become a member of society and they stop identifying themselves as a student, instead of keeping this mindset of me being a lifelong student. So I think that from the perspective of students, the higher education system needs to make much better connection between the science and how this is communicated to the society, and how the society in general is engaged in these topics. Because I think that a lot of things that were mentioned today, like fake news, the reporting, the effects of media, I think that maybe these things wouldn't have such a huge impact if the education would in fact bridge better these two parts of the society.
Thank you. And Massimiliano Bucchi, from your observatory, what kind of tools could be the most useful in the future?
Yes, I will mention three things that could be done. One is long-term, and is to promote better and more higher education. The more people are educated, the better they can navigate also in the quality of information. And talking about data, we shouldn't forget that Italy, apart from Romania, is the country in Europe with the smallest percentage of people with a university degree, 18% versus Finland, Sweden, 38% or so. So this is one thing. Of course, it's a long-term aim. Then I think to recognize and evaluate at the institutional level science communication as part of the performance of academic and research institutions. This is very important, which doesn't mean to train every researcher to become a science communicator. This would be silly. We should respect individual freedom and different talents and different attitudes. But I think it means to build a mainstream awareness among new generation of researchers that science communication is part of the institutional duty of the institutions they belong to. And last point, to build professional competencies. People who are trained in science communication that can work with institutions. In Italy, but not just in Italy, during the pandemic, within our scientific and technical committee who was advising the government, there was not a single expert, not in science communication, in communication. There were experts in different topics, not just in epidemiology, virology, but there was no competence in science communication or communication in general. I think this is a major challenge, and I think it is something that it should be addressed within the next few years.
Thank you. Thank you, Massimiliano. And in the point of view of Director General of Democracy, what could be the tools, for example, to recognize the relevance of scientific communication at official level, at institutional level, could be useful, and why?
Well, I mean, this really is one of the central focuses in the work of the Council of Europe in the area of education and education for democratic culture. If we come back to what we were discussing in the first round, and I'd like to, coming back to Ricardo's mentioning of the videos coming from Bucha, and when you start asking yourself, how come there are so many people who are ready to accept all sorts of attempts to instrumentalize, manipulate, distort, and you ask yourself, how come there were so many people, and still are during the pandemics, that were open and embracing all sorts of misinformations, why there was such a great mistrust toward science. And I was very impressed by the Professor Pivanis and his intervention about the science, how its biggest, very important. But I think also what we see is that we actually, in order to have this improvement in place, in order to have a quantitative improvement in that relationship between citizen, society, science, knowledge, rationality, you need something more than just accessibility to facts, even if as solid and verified they are. I think you also need attitudes, skills, and values, and capacity for critical thinking among the citizens in order to have that model work in the way it should, and sustain and support and nurture democracy in our society. So what we do and what we did over the last couple of years is try to develop methodologies and instruments that do exactly that. Something that it's called the Framework Competence for Democratic Citizenship, which is defines 20 competencies which classified in 4 groups that I already mentioned: values, attitudes, skills, and critical thinking, with the also defined descriptors, learning outcomes, if you want, for each of these categories that can help teachers, education professionals to introduce them, not only in their classes, in the teaching, but also in a way they they organize educational process in their organization, school or other. And it's a very down-to-earth, very practical way in helping, providing that assistance to educational professionals in order to basically get those principles in practice. Just a little anecdote, a couple of years back I was invited to a round table by this president of Slovenia about fighting hate speech, and I mentioned this framework of competence for democratic citizenship, and he gave me at the end, because I always tend to speak too long, he said, you have 20 seconds, Mr. Gruden, to explain what this is about. And I said, the frame of competence is an attempt to transmit to children values that we would like to see in politicians. And I was never invited again after that. But so this is what this is, I think, something that we do, and of course it is also developed for different situations, age groups, and of course it's also very relevant for higher education. Students, of course, are not small kids that need to be taught in the same way these things, but on the other hand, they're also not completely formed active, engaged citizens with all the skills and competency that are necessary for them. So you need to adapt it both, and it also cannot be reduced only to an hour or two as a special subject. I think it has to be something that transpires and imbibes, if you want, the entire life of an educational institution, including the university, the way it is taught, the way it is organized, the way the students and teachers interact, the way the university itself interacts with its environment in all these respects. So this is, I mean, one of the, I think, very important, very practical, very concrete ways in which we are trying to achieve these goals. The other one, I'm not going to describe it now, but I just mentioned it because it's important. It's important for Italy. I think Italy can be very proud of it, and the Italian university community is how the universities can be important in with their democratic mission in their environment, is the what we call the European Qualification Passport for Refugees that was developed after the Syrian war, was successfully used after the Afghanistan. Education is now extremely important in recognizing the qualifications of people who fled from Ukraine. And I'm mentioning it also here because it's important, but because Italy has been among the first to join, engage, and the universities in Italy are very active partners. And now we have, I think, more than 50 refugees that actually are studying in Italian universities because of their previous qualifications being recognized through the system that we have developed in the Council of Europe through that passport. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And Riccardo Haupt, I have a difficult question for you. You mentioned the fake news, and or we know how it is important to recognize and to educate the citizen to recognize the fake news. But how is it possible, in your opinion?
Well, I think this is an extremely, on the one hand, easy question to answer, on the other, hard question to answer. Study, content, and preparation are key elements to communicate to mass public, and if things are done properly, meaning that if you're writing or talking or producing a video content on a scientific matter, if you want to avoid fake news, well, the best thing you can do is study, because if you study, you will transmit knowledge to people who are listening to you, and if you have a big audience, then there is a chance that your audience will convince some other people. So we've seen that the best performing contents in terms of fighting fake news were the one more database, more fact-based, and then of course with the greatest communication skills in it. And then this kind of goes to the role of science in mass communication and on social media, especially. So the thing here is that, especially science, when it has to deal with the phenomenon, with the a typically social media phenomena and problem like fake news has to kind of change its paradigm. So the thing here is the science needs to, just for a second, step down from his teacher's desk and go at the lower level and speak and discuss with persons at the same height, looking them in their eyes. If not even a super properly and knowledgeable content, but if it is perceived as something coming from above, then what we've experienced in 24 months working on the pandemic, speaking, let's say, interacting with almost 10 million users every month, is that there is a backlash risk of people saying, oh, here's again another big professor saying me what I need to think. So here, I really welcome what Massimiliano was saying. The thing is, there needs to be a proper, steady and solid relationship between the scientific world and the communication community. What we've done for the last 20 months was literally to ring and call on the phone scientists, experts and stuff, in order to have them preparing us to build content that could be massive, because this is our task, mine, our mission. We want to speak about complex things without making them, let's say, fake, but with content on it. And so it is, I'm really happy to hear what Massimiliano was saying, to work together on building a or more forum where science and the communication would interact more they can, because it is really hard to bring probably a scientist and build with him a language that is actually really that can work on social media, for example. So the thing is, everyone needs to do what he's best at. So scientists must do scientists and communicators must do communicators. But the important thing is that there is a match between them. And when this match happens, then I think that's the secret ingredient of the Coca-Cola success. And on the other hand, actually contrasting fake news.
Thank you very much. I think we could have the time for some questions from the public, if you like. Please. The microphone. You can use that microphone. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Vesil Mehmedi. I'm ambassador of North Macedonia here in Italy. So I guess I'm a politician in comparison to most of the scientists that we had here and researchers. So my question would be the following. The first premise, I would say, we are talking about a world phenomenon that ordinary citizens do not like politicians. Unfortunately, most of the communication and dissemination of scientific knowledge until now was done by politicians. And I have to admit that since ordinary citizens do not like us, so do you believe that only by presenting the research and science and results, only by trained scientists would be better to be admitted to accept the knowledge, the results that you are producing by ordinary citizens, because as social psychologists would call the confirmation bias, ordinary citizens want to learn and to get knowledge and information only about the beliefs that they already have. So they are seeking a knowledge and information in order to confirm their own biases. And that bias is that they don't like politicians, So do you believe that by introducing or putting upfront scientists, trained scientists, so that complex data to be simplified to ordinary citizens, would they believe more to the results and research and to enforce and strengthen democracy even more? Thank you.
Please.
Well, I think that's a good question. Well, the first thing, I can start with an anecdote. I just have a look before this workshop to the media, and you may know that we have an election on next Sunday for the French presidency. And there was one candidate from extreme right, I would say, that actually said that one physician in France called Didier Raoult, who is a promoter of hydroxychloroquine, saved lives while the others probably killed people. And this guy would actually be his health minister if he would be elected. Hopefully he will not be elected. But the reason I'm mentioning that is that Didier Raoult was actually convicted of having really bad science during the pandemics. And that promoted a lot of studies on hydroxychloroquine, and also that supported in the citizen mind the fact that this was a treatment, an effective treatment, while actually all the evidence progressively showed that it was not. So for sure, this is not, I would say, a responsible attitude by far. And that links to the fact that I would agree with you on the fact that it is not possible to promote science if the politicians themselves are not promoting science. That's simply impossible, because the politicians have access to the TV, to the media, and so on. So that's very clear. On the other end, and that has been mentioned by my colleagues, it is also probably true that to even convince the politician that science is important, that science should actually support the public policies, we actually have to communicate. We cannot only rely on the quality of science. We have to communicate on science. And the last thing I should say is probably that when we talk about science for citizens or science with citizens, it is also something which is important because it makes more familiar for most citizens the fact that science is accessible and science can be shared, which is also important to actually give more support to science as a whole, and also, again, to convince the politicians that science is essential and should be absolutely central in making any decision on public policies.
Please.
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's true that many people don't like politicians. And if you're very honest, I mean, you can't really always blame them. But I also, on the other hand, don't think that this is the whole of the story. And I don't think that by providing alternative disseminators that would bypass the people who have lost, not all politicians, but those who did, the trust of the public would solve the problem, because I think we are confronted with much broader crisis of confidence that does not only concern the relationship between citizens or part of the citizens and politicians, but institutions in general. And many people have similar doubts and lack of confidence or mistrust or feel rejection for the reasons that I mentioned before. Also include in that the scientists themselves. That's the only thing that can explain. Again, I absolutely agree with what Massimo said, not because people are stupid, but because this does sort of is both generated in response to psychological, emotional, social, economic sentiments, feeling, frustrations, needs that are a result of accumulated situations over the last couple of decades, very often justified injustice. So we won't be able to solve this just by saying, okay, you stop talking, you should be the one and people are going to trust you, or even if you improve. So we really have to address that breakdown in trust that exists, because it's not only, of course, unfortunate and dangerous for science, it is extremely detrimental to societies and to the democracies, our democratic systems, in the moments when we would need most to have that relationship between science and people's confidence at the highest, at its strongest, when we are dealing with these situations such as the pandemic, when we are dealing with the technological digital transition, when we're dealing with the climate change, we're dealing with all those things. You see actually that the atmosphere of mistrust is not improving, and that's very dangerous. So we need to find all the ways, and I'm coming back to what it says, it's not only about improving access to facts, to science, to its results, it's also about investing in people's capacities, skills, knowledge to be able to engage with that, understand, embrace this. And it takes a long time, but if you don't start now, the problems in 20 years are going to be even worse. And how that disconnect between values and facts can actually work in both ways. I read, we say a lot about how young people are concerned about the future, especially because of climate change. We see an unprecedented mobilization of young people against the, protesting against the indifference, perceived or real lack of action of the institutions and authorities in this respect. We sort of automatically assume that this is a progressive engagement, but it's not always the truth. I mean, there was a research from 2020 by Timothy Garton-Ash, former rector of the Open Society University, who found out that in that population in Europe, in, of the young people between 18 and 27, who are intelligent and literate and understand the scientific facts, and that's why they know and they are concerned about their future, more than half of them gives greater trust in resolving climate challenges to authoritarian regimes than democratic regimes. That's the other side of the danger that we are facing, that we have a young generation of people, again, who are not stupid, contrary, very well informed of what is happening, but are losing faith in a democratic society because he thinks that it's not really providing them. So we have problems coming from left, right, center. We better get out our act together. So.
Thank you. Are there any questions, please?
Can I unmask? Oh no, perhaps I can speak. I'm a former politician, I apologize, so but people don't like politicians. But I would like to bring to your attention the fact that, as I think, as Undersecretary of State della Vedova mentioned, science is a human right. So to complement what Mr. Levy was saying before, you don't have to convince politicians. They have a legal obligation to affirm universal human rights. Science is in Article 27 of the European Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not in the European Convention of Human Rights, unfortunately, as stated as that, but it's more detailed in Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I think all of us that are involved in science, I'm now coordinating a platform that is called Science for Democracy, should look into this general comment number 25, which lists the elements of the right to science and the obligations that countries have. And every country in the world, even China, has ratified the International Covenant, so they have an obligation. And they have to not only promote or try to promote or pretend to promote science, if they don't do it, they violate international law. Now, the United Nations doesn't have a tribunal to do that, but there's a committee at the UN in Geneva that can address and redress violations of those rights. And that is important also as an element of primary education or high school education and university education, because if we start teaching the younger generations that there's universal human rights, and among them also a right to science, which is freedom of research, sharing of knowledge, and promoting scientific progress and the application of scientific progress. Then, little by little, I think we will have more people that perhaps will not look at authoritarian regimes as the best governing mechanism to a better future, but we are seeing that an authoritarian regime is provoking a worse future for an entire country and possibly the rest of the world, rather than trying to use this moral suasion of soft power that is always associated with the Europeans at large, or the European Union in particular. So it's an obligation to promote and respect this right to science. And I think this is an extra element that should be also put at the center of the work of the Council of Europe, because the Council of Europe is an organization that wants to affirm the international rule of law. And this is an element of that. Thank you. So it wasn't a question, but like a political speech, but sorry about that.
Okay. Please.
But as it was mentioned, I absolutely agree, and I welcome that mention. I think it's very important. I think also it's very important to understand, on one hand, to recognize the importance of having these things enshrined in the international rules and institutions. And coming from the Council of Europe, I'm the first that's going to say that. I mean, it's not specifically mentioned European Convention of Human Rights, but you have clearly articles that would support and protect that right also within the convention. And I think that the European Convention, European Court of Human Rights is perhaps the most important civilizational achievement of Europe. Maybe I'm not fully objective after the Second Euro, the fact that you had that created. But I think what we have seen now in the last weeks, but I think also months, perhaps years, is also the limit of institutions when they are left alone, when they are not supported by, on one hand, very coherent and consistent and assertive insistence on the respect of these obligations from the peers of those who have difficulties, and on the hand, when these institutions are not anchored in the environments in which citizens understand them, can engage with them, can are motivated, can see that this is something that's important for them. Because without that, if these institutions are seen as something that is actually an instrument of alienated bureaucrats somewhere that in some places, be it Strasbourg, Geneva, Brussels, or New York, are using them against their interest, so on, then of course they not only do show the limit, but they fail. And that's why it's important that we are investing much more in these environments in all our countries, in all regions of the world. And I'd just like to say I very much, if I understood correctly, I very much agree and welcome your remark about these things being universal values. We should not always think of it as European. Europeans have maybe developed the most elaborated system for the implementation and protection of values, but which are, I think, if we're honest, are not European values. If you say they're universal, they should be.
Are there any questions?
Yes, if I may. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm the director of an interdisciplinary lab at the International School for Advanced Studies in Trieste, and where we have been running the longest standing master in science communication in Italy. So we started almost 40 years ago training communicator in science. So all the topics which have been discussed today are really dear to us. We have been the first essentially to do this kind of experiment, which is really successful, and we hope. Then we could discuss which kind of support from this we can discuss later. No, but my point, I would like to go back to the role of politicians with a bitter consideration. So early this afternoon, the Minister for University and Research, she said something like we should make people believe in the value of science. And how you make people believe in something, that you value something now, is simply to see how much you fund something. And unfortunately, what I observed is that 40 days of war has been enough to convince the Italian parliament, for example, to raise the military expenses to 2% of the gross domestic product, doing something that 2 years of pandemic didn't manage to do for the funding of research. So the role of politician, I think is important, no, in this respect. So if they want to give a sign, they can do that by simply by simply funding a certain activity and in the same way they do others. Okay? I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I found this this particularly applied to Italy, where the percentage of gross domestic product devoted to financing science is well below the European average. So, but we immediately trying to align the military expenses, but not the research one. I don't know. If you have a comment of that, I would really appreciate.
Well, first of all, I would, of course, agree with what you said. I think that's important. One maybe fact that illustrates what you said is the story of the vaccine against COVID. I mean, in a sense, we were not prepared at all. I think fundamental research was there, and the fact that we were able to sequence the genome of the virus very rapidly is undoubtedly linked to the capacity of fundamental research to do that. But what actually was missing is probably the link with innovation and the fact that if you don't allocate sufficient amount of resources to do that, you will not be successful. And in a sense, although we can say, okay, we have actually, or the ERC have supported the research, the fundamental research that helped to have the BioNTech success story, and then to provide one of the vaccine that was really effective. I think if we have a real clear analysis of what we are missing, we are clearly missing a sufficient amount of resources on research and innovation and to transfer the basic knowledge to society. That's very clear, and that's what is in your message, I guess.
Please.
Maybe I can also offer my perspective. I had the chance 4 years ago to participate in a program which was designed by the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and this program was being done in collaboration with Danish scientists who also double as politicians. So for me, it was the first time, well, coming from the Southeastern Europe, seeing that politicians are actually scientists and that they collaborate with together, regardless of whether who is on the opposition or who is on the ruling side, just to make sure that what they're doing is according to the national plans and strategies. So I think that it really depends also on the mentality of the space, of the political space, and the preparedness to allow, I would say, they're not outsiders, but like researchers to take up the positions, because I think here it's mostly linked, okay, what you study or what field you're interested in, then you will kind of finish and get this sort of job. So, for example, if you are a scientist, it's not very probable that you will go into politics. But I think what I really appreciate in, for example, Nordic countries is that this doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If you have the drive and passion to go for it, usually there will be programs, and you can easily engage with scientists and ask for additional education to take up the positions that you like. While I would say here, if you come as a student who is a science student and you wish to enter politics even on a low level, here it's very negative, because education needs to be, of course, separate from the politics, but even if you continue, you're considered quite young, inexperienced, and people kind of try to push you aside because you're, let's say, creating mess where it necessarily is undesirable. So I think that for me, seeing the openness of the Nordic countries, for example, toward this, really shows how different mentality actually can impact not only the political space, but also how the society accepts scientists. Because for them, these scientists, politicians are sort of a celebrity. While here, I don't know if I know any scientists who are in politics.
The microphone, please. Thank you.
I only wanted to say that Angela Merkel was a scientist, so perhaps she's the only exception to the rule, but she was.
Are there other questions, please?
More than a question is a comment. I think, we can see that science or the science process or scientific research can be, it's a very multifaceted issue, okay? But let's not forget one thing, that science itself is based on ignorance. The most difficult process in scientific research is to have a good problem, which is recognizing the ignorance of the scientist in trying to resolve a problem. And I think we need to make a distinction between the science and the scientific research process and the enabling of the scientific process. And the enabling is what I think Europe could do much better. Because what we are missing, and we could clearly see it from the various comments, for example, is a strong link, like it happens in the Northern European countries or in the US or in other places, between education and scientific research process and the creation of wealth and the return to the citizens. So for me, a key point in which we should do better is on two directions. The one is communication to the citizens of the role and the importance of science, which is a long-term investment and should be perceived like basic education, healthcare, as a key service to society. And the second one, to achieve that, science education must become part of culture of the young student from the first classes, as it was mentioned in school.
As science journalist, I can say that it's true. It needs a more efficient communication between researchers and society. But my question is about language. Because we know in Italy we don't have so many journalists specialized in science. And it could be a problem because not all are able to communicate some issues in the correct way. But this is only one of the aspects of the problem. The other one is the language of the researchers. So I think that could be important to teach to the researchers the importance to use the common language, the everyday language to communicate to the citizens, to the politicians, to the institutions. What is your thinking about this?
I think that's important. We had last September a congress in Paris that was European, and that was dedicated to what we could have learned from the pandemics in that perspective. And it was there were at that congress journalists, politicians, scientists. And it was very clear from this event that we actually should create even probably curricula that allow the interaction between journalists and scientists. Because and in a sense, it is true that when you look at the mainstream media, I would say, are organized, many of the journalists are relatively have a relatively low education regarding research. And on the other end, as it has been mentioned, many scientists do know at all how to communicate. And they actually put forward some parts of what they actually perceive at the scientific evidence at a certain point, which might be important, but might be also dangerous in many ways, because that's not maybe sufficiently supported, or that is their opinions and not really supported by the evidence. So this interaction in a very structured way is probably extremely important, and this is still to be done. There are initiatives in Europe and elsewhere where this is done, but that's probably, and that was probably what was done in Italy in this master, but this is important, and this should be probably promoted at a large scale.
Thank you. Peggy Pavlovich?
Yeah, I can only agree. I think that there should be some sort of communication that is a little more universal, that would teach the media also how to communicate this. I think it's very, very relevant. And I see from, for example, from my country, where you don't have to have a school, for example, to be a journalist. It can be a hobby that turns into a job. I would say that this would be very, very relevant, and I would really love to see more journalists cover the scientific topics.
Thank you. Massimiliano Bucchi, do you see from Observa Science Society this kind of problem in the researchers' capacity to communicate with the public?
Yes, as I said, I see a big challenge, and I think we should abandon the illusion, so to say, that we can go back to the old times that were probably not so good as they look now. This is often an effect of nostalgia, where the only process for communicating science was through the mediation of professional mediators, like journalists, for example. That word, of course, that word had a very simplistic answer to the question of quality. How did we tell what was quality, reliable science communication? If it's in the BBC, if it's on the Corriere della Sera, right? If it's in a science museum, must be credible, trustworthy, something it can interest me. But now, of course, we live in that word still exists to some extent, but we live in a completely different media landscape, where people have to make decisions every few seconds. Is this interesting? Is this trustworthy? So this is why I say there is much, much more opportunities. There are many more opportunities, but also responsibilities for research institutions, where they put on their Facebook page or their YouTube channels. Because it's not just, as I said, it's not just a question of fake news, but when I go to the website of a major research institution, what am I getting there? Is that the state of the art of research in this field, or is it the self-promotion of their own activities? Both are legitimate aims, but they are two different things from my point of view as a citizen. So this is, I think we have to get prepared to navigate in this new world, or this contemporary landscape, rather than be nostalgic about the past, which, as I said, it probably wasn't as nice as we consider it now.
Thank you. Matthias Gruden.
Yeah, I can just follow up on Massimo again. I tend to agree that we won't be able to get that monster back into the bottle, or whatever the image would be. And we have to think of how we're going to deal with that on the demand side, not only supply side of the. And coming back to the last remark before that children should be taught science from the first year in school, I agree. Reminds me, a couple of years back, the French presidency of the Committee of Ministers organized a conference of the Ministers of Education that was dealing specifically on the topic of education for digital citizenship. And as a keynote speaker in an act of bureaucratic subversiveness, we have invited director of Ars Electronica, Gerfried Stocker, from Austria, one of the most important festivals, institutions that brings together technology and art. And he had a very effective speech that made a lot of impression on the ministers around, shocked them. And he said, what you need for a successful education for digital citizenship, and I think to a large extent this goes not just for the digital citizenship, but generally for the subject that we are talking today. He said, you need to teach programming from the first class, because kids need to know science, need to know what's in the black box. They should not just use it, they should understand what it is about. And without having that minimum, and not that low, a level of knowledge about programming or science in general in the population, we are not going to be able to solve that problem. So I fully agree. But it's not enough to have just that, because second thing is that you need to teach them values, a very traditional human values: solidarity, empathy, recognition of diversity, tolerance. That too is necessary. Thirdly, critical thinking. I mentioned all essential in order to be able to do what you said people should be doing, and selecting what they trust, what they don't trust when they're confronted with those sources. And fourthly, and my favorite also, he said, the fourth element is art. Because without art and without culture, there's not going to be any innovation, there's going to be any creativity, there's going to be any progress. And I agree with him.
Thank you. And Riccardo, what is your point of view about the capacity of scientists to communicate to the public?
Well, as I mentioned before, I'm on the one hand, I agree with what Massimiliano Bucchi said. On the other hand, I'm still of the opinion of saying people must do what they are best at. So I guess the best thing, rather than, I guess it's super important to build and grow some communication skills within the scientific community. But I still believe that the best thing is to, like for example, the work we do, we will never be an alternative to a proper scientific explanation of a phenomena. But what we can do is building curiosity towards that specific phenomena and science. What do I mean? If my journalist, my communicator here at WIL, for example, is properly prepared also through an interaction with a scientist, then what he'll manage to do is to build a 2-minute video in which he will explain how vaccine works, but he will never be and build a totally satisfying explanation. But the idea is that we as communicators build curiosity, build a little bit of culture around a topic, and then we will never be enough to build proper knowledge. But if someone just triggers curiosity in my mind, then I look for more science. Then I'll do what we call the double click. So we're not enough. We're the first click, and our objective is to build the second click towards scientific communication, or for example, today, a geopolitical communication, proper one. But that's the idea. I'll build some more curiosity towards some specific and specialized areas.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the public? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Emanuele Clemente. I'm a student here at Sapienza University of Rome. In what we spoke of this afternoon, the two main themes were the pandemic and the war now in Ukraine. And this may be probably the two biggest events that occurred in the last 2 decades in Europe. And while the first one, the pandemic, may have shown us that we are not invincible as a species, the second one instead showed how fragile our institutions or democracy in general can be. And what do you think that could be done to prevent another major event such as these that may show how fragile we are, and what we can do to prevent these things, and what actually can be changed in the communication, because one of another main focus of this workshop was the theme of communication. We spoke about fake news and how science is now a major presence in communications, for example, the presence of scientists in primetime TV. And what do you think that we can learn from these experiences, and what we should be doing differently now at the moment and maybe in the future? Thank you.
Well, if I understand correctly the question, I think something that we have learned probably is that some of the values on which we rely are particularly fragile. And it has been mentioned that academic freedom or autonomy are critical values that should be absolutely protected. And this is not a detail. By far, we of course know that in some countries it's obvious that, for instance, academic freedom has been really lowered and in a sense a victim of the public policies. But even in my country, for instance, in France, which I believe is still a democracy compared to many others, there are some decisions that sometimes are taken by the government that are not so respectful of the autonomy of universities and even to some extent of academic freedom. So this is a continuous struggle, I would say. So of course, when we have the war in Ukraine, we know what it can be. It can be dramatic, and it is not. I hope that it will be solved, but it's of course very difficult, particularly for the Ukrainian. But one thing that we probably should remind, and that in that case, is that all the values that we try to defend are critical. Solidarity, of course, academic freedom, of course, and that's also is something that we should have support from the citizens, because it has been mentioned that education is important, that during and even at primary school, but of course this is feasible if we still have the tools that are the fact that science is science. Education should be, of course, based on evidence and on these values, and that's probably absolutely critical. Having said that, I know that it is not very practical or pragmatic, but it is probably critical.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Please.
Very briefly, I think that it's very difficult to put together situations like this horrible war and pandemic, but there are commonalities when it comes to our response and when it comes to some of the reasons that led to this situation. And I think that they sometimes thrive, they're sometimes accelerated, they're sometimes helped by the fact that our societies are faced with a deep breakdown of trust, especially in their institutions. And that's where we need to start restoring it, because any weaknesses, any mistrust, if it's prolonged and if it deepens, is then being used for those who are working to undermine those institutions at national and international level, who are offering alternative solutions that are departing from the values that in Europe we have decided we're going to build our future together in. So we need to restore that trust at all levels. I think politicians, I don't think we should ignore them. I think we need politicians. You cannot have democratic society without politicians. So we need to restore that trust at all levels. And what I would say is integrity, transparency, competence, accountability, and education, 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 and education.
Thank you. So we are going to conclude this interesting and I hope useful meeting. The relationship between science and society is a very difficult challenge, but we are the instrument, and I hope that this meeting could be the first step towards a network of experts, European experts, to effort together this problem. Everyone with his competences. And at the next time, I hope that we can see together in a better world and to speak about science and society with a positive spirit. Thank you very much to everyone, and good evening.